Thank you. So I teach courses about development and differences in development, differences like these, where within a city, within a country, and between countries, you can see differences in development. And I do that at Occidental College in Los Angeles, and I used to do it at the Naval Postgraduate School, where I taught for 7 years, students who came from the military, who were military officers, who had gone to Iraq and Afghanistan, and who were very good at breaking things, but not so good at rebuilding them. And the lesson that I would teach them every time, that first basic lesson, was always this one, that nation building is not like building a house, where you can have a kitchen and a living room and bedrooms, and you just build it, and you've got a house. Well, you don't get a nation if you have a blueprint from the beginning and you follow that blueprint through. That the work that we do in development and in nation building is a lot more like gardening as metaphor. Now, what do I mean by gardening as metaphor? Well, you know, in gardening, the weather changes. The soil conditions are different depending on where you live. The locals know best when to prune. They know what's going to happen. In fact, it's really about taking away from my students this idea that they have control over everything, which means taking away that illusion of control. So for gardeners, they have no illusion of control. We create the right growing conditions. We nurture a healthy soil life, set up our lifestyle so we can tend our crops and grow our healthy plants and watch them grow. We adjust as we go along, removing excess weeds, mulching, watering, fertilizing when necessary, and picking off pests. But ultimately, the end result almost always includes crop failures and unexpected successes, and we feel more like stewards, sometimes even observers, than masters of our domain. Now, I sound like the world's best gardener, but I actually do this to my plants. So please, don't necessarily listen to me about gardening. Caveat emptor in that case. I could have never imagined, of course, back in the mid-1990s, when I was actually a Harry Potter lookalike, 2 years before Harry Potter, being where I am here today. And it's really the story of how did I get to where I am, and I want to tell you a little bit of that today. So in 2009, I had the privilege of giving a talk about my family's escape from Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge, and it was really the story of my mom's cunning and determination to save her 5 children, including myself, from the Khmer Rouge. I had 6 minutes to tell my story. This afternoon, I've got 14 more minutes, and I want to tell it in a way where I can display or highlight everyday encounters with hidden superheroes who've appeared at critical moments in my life. Now, I'm going to spoil it for those of you who haven't seen the TED Talk, but at the end, my mom is in the audience. She gets a standing ovation. My wife, who is 8 months pregnant with our first child, is also in the audience. And this being TED, there were some very important people. I had the feeling then, though, that maybe I wouldn't get the chance to do this much more frequently with my mom. She was 73. We wouldn't get the chance to travel together and do these sorts of things, perhaps going forward. And little did I know how right I was, because 7 months later, she passed away. And it's really given me that chance to think about the legacy, the lessons of her life, the things that matter. And I'm going to try to do this for you in 6 acts. So from refugee to professor in 6 acts: Cambodia first, Vietnam, where we flee to, France, where we are refugees, America, where we immigrate, the world, which is where I'd like to try to do as much as possible, and then return to Cambodia, where my lessons, my legacy, hopefully will have an impact. Anyhow, Act 1, Cambodia. So we've got my mom and dad here in 1969. We're living in literally a mansion. I got the chance to visit it a few years ago. It's got at least 10 rooms, 10 bedrooms. Each is now occupied by a separate family. After the Khmer Rouge, everybody came back to other people's properties. In Phnom Penh, the city was itself quite beautiful. Movies played, like The Little Prince, starring the actual head of state of Cambodia, Prince Sihanouk himself. But across the world, President Nixon was pointing to Cambodia, and he had this to say about Cambodia in 1971. There are no American combat troops in Cambodia. There are no American combat advisors in Cambodia. There will be no American combat troops or advisors in Cambodia. We will aid Cambodia. Cambodia is the Nixon doctrine in its purest form. Now, of course, what he meant was that the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which you see here cutting across Cambodia, needed to be stopped because it was resupplying the Viet Cong and therefore the enemies of the US. And the way that would be done is by dropping by having B-52 bombers drop their loads. And much of the country was, as a result, bombed. So 113,716 sites were bombed, more tons than in all of World War II Europe, including the tonnage equivalent of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, by April 17, 1975, Phnom Penh, the capital city, falls, and the Khmer Rouge come in to the city. They're not happy. They're very much like you, teenagers, probably would have gone to school or to university even if they'd had the chance, but they had joined the guerrilla movement, and the violence and the bloodletting soon began. 2 million people had gone to Phnom Penh to seek refuge, and they told all these people, all the residents of Phnom Penh, to evacuate within 3 days. That included my own family, which had been living there for a number of years. And in this mass exodus, they took us all to different parts of the countryside, to rural areas, to work in essentially labor camps, rice-growing fields and so on, which urban residents had no idea of how to do. The leader of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, shown there on the left, has never faced justice. He died under house arrest. He died in his sleep. The only way I can describe Cambodia is to use, at that time, they used the words of Michael Paternity, who said, "Once upon a time, there was a regime so evil that it created an anti-society where torture was currency and music, books, and love were abolished. This regime ruled for 4 years and murdered nearly 2 million of its citizens, a quarter of the population." Now, Stalin said that the death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of a million is a statistic. I know this is a big number, even a quarter, 1 in 4 people, and it's hard to even grasp that. So let me take you to a place where we can lower the order of magnitude a bit, a place called Tuol Sleng, genocide center that is now a museum, where up to 16,000 people were killed, tortured. It was a school, of all places, turned into a torture center where in offices and classrooms, on beds and medieval chain-looking devices, mothers and their infants were killed and deemed to be enemies of the people, said to be both KGB and CIA at the same time. Really children who ended up essentially in killing fields at the end of their stay. Now, at that same time, in 1975, around sunset, my parents and my family has been relocated to Pursat province, where they're made to grow rice. That day, the Khmer Rouge call a meeting and say that the Vietnamese government would like its citizens back. And my mother, who spoke a little bit of Vietnamese, decided that she could possibly, pretend to be Vietnamese, speaking a little bit of Vietnamese. So she gets my dad and herself to sign up our family to be on that list of Vietnamese citizens needing to return to Vietnam. On the 3rd day of our journey towards Vietnam, my father, who'd been sick with dysentery and malnutrition, passes away. He didn't speak Vietnamese, so it actually is bittersweet because, it would have been a problem if he had to actually prove that he was Vietnamese. He wouldn't have been able to. So that gets us to Act 2, Vietnam. How do we get there? Well, language was used as a passport, essentially. And my mom's Vietnamese wasn't very good. She had given all the boys girls' names and all the girls' boys' names, but thankfully she met a lady, a Vietnamese lady, who was very, very kind in the same camp that we were testing. And the lady, basically a superhero, tutored her for 3 days, drilled her like a drill sergeant in Vietnamese, and got her to pass. And here we are, my mom and I, in Vietnam, and later on at a cousin's wedding in Ho Chi Minh City. She's quite thin there, my aunt and uncle, and myself. But even then, my mom didn't think that Vietnam, which by then was communist, was going to be a place for us to live in. I mean, it didn't have much of a future. So she wanted to get us to France, our next destination, so Act 3. And she was smart enough when we got to Vietnam to claim then to be actually Cambodian again, not Vietnamese, because that would let us leave Vietnam. But how to get to France? we needed help. And it turned out to be another superhero, a French citizen who was, very stereotypically, chain-smoking French citizen, and a superhero because he essentially took on the cause of our family to get us out of Vietnam as Cambodian refugees. He found a lady to take the name, who had the same last name as my mother's, to claim that she was related to her and to sign paperwork that said, you know, we're family and that she can sponsor us. He jumped the fence of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to get paperwork signed even after they'd closed, because by his watch it wasn't yet closing time. And we get to France, here my sister and I and more of our family. But even then, by 1985, it isn't really France that's the future. It's really the United States. And an aunt visiting from the United States tells us we should go to the US. We should join her and start a new life in America. And it's with this very plain ticket here, issued by Pan Am, that we fly to America and start our new life. Now, of course, America, the land where dreams come true, isn't immediately so perfect for us. We live in essentially a shack at the back of another house, and Christmases are pretty threadbare. Mom has to work in a garment factory in Chinatown to make a living, doing piecemeal garments, and we live on food stamps. I start 7th grade at Willard Junior High School, where I have to essentially learn English, ESL, English as a second language. I take these classes hoping that I'll get better at it. One day, when I have to choose classes for Berkeley High School, I end up in this cafeteria, this actual cafeteria, and that's where we have to choose classes that day. And I've been given a schedule, and I'm just going to do whatever I'm told. But that day, a tutor of mine from Willard is there, and she tells me, for whatever reason, she cares enough to look at my schedule, and she says, well, you know, you're going to take more ESL, it looks like, and I think you should stop taking ESL. You should start taking regular English classes, because the requirements of the University of California say that you need to take 4 years of English. And it's, again, another everyday superhero, this young woman who cares enough to tell me this. And it's really these little things along the way that make a difference. It leads to essentially my mom coming to school for the first time to sign me out of ESL because I couldn't just do it on my own. I had to get a parent to come in. She had never come in for any other reason. And I remember that day. She came in, and I was like, why is she here? Oh, she's here to sign me out of ESL. So at 16, I end up at UC Berkeley, which is another story. I mean, it's a wonderful place, but it's such a big place, and it's such an incredible learning experience. But even then, I don't know that in the future I'll have more opportunities, which turns out to be true because an administrator at Princeton University in its graduate school decides to help me out, decides to give me some advice, and takes me into a program, a junior program in which I get to go study at Princeton for the summer and to learn more about that university. She's another superhero. I mean, I could never have thought of even traveling to the East Coast of the United States at the age of 20 because I just wasn't ready for that. But Princeton ended up being where I would go at 20 for my master's in public affairs. So what you've heard now already is that superheroes have appeared throughout my life. This room is full of everyday superheroes. Behind me, in fact, are all the people on whose shoulders I stand. And this is really a lesson. We can all be everyday superheroes to each other. And we begin by believing in this motto here of, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I've been given a lot, so I wanted to give back. And that's what leads me to Act 5, the World, where after Princeton Graduate School, I ended up at the World Bank working on something I'd never heard of before, social protection. But I do that on the Middle East and North Africa. I have the privilege of working on poverty reduction in Cambodia. And yes, there are perks to working at the World Bank, including riding on the Concorde. But, you know, subsequent to that, I got the opportunity to work at the UN Development Program, and it was to help the world's newest country at the time. In 2002, East Timor had become independent, and I was working on democratic governance. Now, the head of UNDP at that time was a man by the name of Mark Malloch Brown, and in one of his reports he said, "There is no more noble endeavor than the fight for social and global justice and for peace and development." And it's something that I try to teach in my students, this idea from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. And that brings up the idea of rights, but it also brings up the idea of responsibilities. And it's something that I used to teach and still teach now at Occidental and at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is this idea of the responsibility to protect. So this responsibility to protect, R2P, is this new international security and human rights norm that tries to address the international community's failure to prevent and stop genocides, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, the kinds of things that hurt my own family. I know that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations tries certainly to uphold R2P, the responsibility to protect, but that the UN, of course, too often fails to do that, and that when we talk about never again, we keep seeing over and over again. In fact, yesterday was the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, and that was the first genocide in the 20th century. Now we know that after that, the Holocaust consumed the lives of 11 to 17 million, not just Jews, but Romas and homosexuals as well. And we know, of course, that in Rwanda, 800,000 to 1 million Hutus killed Tutsis. And of course, in Bosnia, in the first genocide since World War II, 200,000 plus people died in televised images like these, and in places like Srebrenica, where 8,000 men and boys were killed. And of course, more recently, we know that in Darfur, 300,000 plus have died and are still suffering. Now, Act 6, returning to Cambodia. If you'll recall, I talked about this torture center, and the actual head of that torture center is a man who's still alive. His name is Duik. He confessed to his crimes in 2009. And, you know, it's a good thing that he confessed. He said what he did, and he admitted fault for that. He was found guilty in 2011 in causing the deaths of at least 12,273 people. He was sentenced to 35 years, reduced to 19 for time already served, which I think is pretty crazy, but anyhow, he actually thought it was too long, and he appealed and lost, thankfully. But the prosecution appealed, and so now he's sentenced to life in prison. But it took about a year for him to get sentenced to life in prison. There was a year when he was technically sentenced to 19 years. On the other side of the world, in New York City, Bernie Madoff was sentenced to 150 years. Now, he's the creator of this biggest Ponzi scheme in the world. He didn't technically kill anyone, although a lot of people committed suicide because of what he did. And he caused about $65 billion in fraud, technically $14 billion in real losses. He's not appealing. In Cleveland, the Cleveland kidnapper, Ariel Castro, was sentenced to life plus 1,000 years. He said at his sentencing, "I'm not a monster." He committed suicide shortly after starting his sentence. And you have to think about who the monster really is. I mean, is it Bernie or is it Duik? The judge in the Bernie Madoff case, Danny Chin, said that he could have given Bernie Madoff 20 or 25 years because that would have effectively been a life sentence. But he reasoned that the symbolism of the longer term was important given the enormity of the crimes. You think about people like Ieng Tirad, the Minister of Social Affairs. Well, she was in charge of the hospital my father died in. She was released due to Alzheimer's, though they do say she might be brought back to the tribunal if she gets better. Her husband, Ieng Sary, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, died at age 87 on March 14th of 2013. He has technically never been found guilty then. He died innocent as a result. Two others, Khieu Samphan, head of state under the Khmer Rouge, and Nguyen Chia, brother number 2, were recently found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. They're still on trial for genocide. That will take several more years. It's a tribunal that has cost now $200 million plus and has found 3 people guilty. I have to think about my late mother, certainly my superhero, whose wisdom comes back to me now because she thought that what goes around comes around. that the people who had caused us so much harm would eventually meet their own fate. She believed, as a Buddhist, in karmic justice, and that even if justice wasn't rendered in her lifetime, maybe they'd be reborn cockroaches in their next lives, right? So there would be somehow justice. In a way, she was able to forgive the fact that that justice wasn't rendered in her life, and so she could move on in her life. And I think that for 15 million Cambodians every day who suffer all manners of injustices and who certainly haven't seen the kind of justice they deserve following the Khmer Rouge, that they can go on and be resilient in some manner because of their belief system. Now, here's my mom in this photo mosaic. She had 7 years of schooling, spoke 5 languages, and saved lives. And the Talmud says that if you save a life, you save the world. Here I am because of what she did, saving my life, making my life possible. But not just mine, the lives of my 4 siblings and also the children that we begot. So, 16 kids between us. Now, 22 lives in all with our own and her own life. And wherever Mom is now, I want to think that, here she is 6 months after my TED Talk. My son, Stephen, is 6 months old here. She got to spend a few months with him. And here he is, 2 years and 7 months, having his good old time. And my daughter, who was born 2 years later in 2011, and then Nathan, born in 2013, that wherever Mom is now, she'd be proud that my latest child, Jasmine, is bringing new hope into the world. Thank you.